And then let's look at the sun, which is a symbol that was so closely related to many aspects of life and chemistry. The sun is not a god. The sun is not God. They knew that. They knew that the sun was responsible for all life on the planet. If the sun were any closer to Earth than it was, then all life on Earth would be destroyed. The atmosphere would burn up. If the sun were any further away from the Earth than it is, then the Earth would turn into a ball of ice. So there was a divine relationship between the sun and the planet Earth. The sun was responsible for all life on this planet. They realized that the sun was the source, was a symbol of a source, of a life behind the light. And they acknowledged that life behind the light. And they gave the sun various names as it moved across the sky. When the sun arose in the morning, they called it Kepre, a word that means rebirth or renewal. So every morning, this symbol of the Creator was reborn on the east. When the sun reached its highest point at noon, it was known as Re, because this Creator was at his highest point. Re was on high. And then as the sun completed its journey, its movement across the sky, it set in the west where it was known as Amen, which means concealed or hidden. This symbol of the Creator was now hidden from view when it set in the western horizon, but they knew with crystal clarity that it would be reborn tomorrow as Kepre, and the cycle would begin all over again for eternity. So this was a symbol that represented their relationship with eternity. So much so that it became an important part of life and death. This is the papyrus of Ani, which you all are familiar with, and you're familiar with. I don't need to go into an interpretation of what all of this represents, but the important part of this symbol is the soul comes before Ma'at to declare its innocence. As this soul is weighed against the feather Ma'at, it recites the 42 declarations of innocence, the 42 admonitions of Ma'at. And the 12 judges listen to the soul's declaration. And if the soul is Ma'at Keru, true of voice, then he goes on to reap his reward in the afterlife, is reborn. This is where the concept of 12 men in the jury comes from. This is where the concept of justice holding the scale of Ma'at comes from. Our history, our culture, our symbols are all over, but many of us don't know that they're ours. All of this, these concepts, began with this concept, this story, which is part history, part mythology. But mythology is important because it represents a higher aspect of life. Myths are necessary for humankind to develop. Asar, the founding father of Kemet, is said to have united the two lands, introduced agriculture and writing, and created the first nation state. He married a sister by the name of Aset. And when Asar decided to travel, after his nation was established, he decided to travel to other countries in Africa to help them develop. And in his absence, he left his queen to run their nation, which says something about his love and respect for his woman. He didn't marry an airhead. He married someone who was a reflection of him. They were co-rulers. Unfortunately, as the story goes, his brother Set felt that he should have been left in charge. He murdered his brother, and Set fled for her life and found his body. And then the spirit of Asar impregnated her. And then 9 months later, Aset gave birth to their son Heru, who was born to avenge the murder of his father. And his primary purpose in life was to reclaim his father's throne. The first virgin birth story in the recorded history of mankind, over 6,000 years old. And when Heru fulfilled the reasons for his being born, confronted his uncle Set and defeated him, life in Kemet changed for the better. But we don't know this story because someone else has claimed it. Someone else has changed the names. They changed the name of Asar from Asar to Osiris. Changed the name of Aset from Aset to Isis. Changed the name of Heru from Heru to Horus. So recovering the names, knowing their stories is crucial to our development, our continued evolution as a people. But when Heru defeated Set, he reclaimed his father's throne. And when he reclaimed his father's throne, according to the story, his father Asar was resurrected from the dead and took his place on the throne of judgment. The oldest story of resurrection known to man. Father and son were co-regents. Heru ruled over the physical world. His father ruled over the transphysical world. Every king, when he ascended to the throne, would take on the Heru name so he could embody the spirit of Heru. It is from the word Heru or Horus that we have derived the word hero. So you would take on these qualities, these larger-than-life qualities, and rule as Heru in the physical world so that when you died and became an ancestor, you would be resurrected as a Sar. So these were the cornerstones of life and life after death. And then after Asar was resurrected, Heru then erected this symbol to represent the resurrection of his father, a Tekken. This is the 6,000-year-old symbol which represents the resurrection of Asar, the oldest story of resurrection known to mankind. So wherever you see this object in the world, you should automatically understand clearly that this is a 6,000-year-old symbol that represents the resurrection of an African personality. Wherever you see this object in the world, you should recognize that it is a 6,000-year-old symbol that represents the resurrection of an African personality. So after living in Washington, D.C. for several years and traveling to Kemet on 2 occasions, I came back to D.C. and saw that Kemet was all over Washington, D.C. And I began to ask questions. Why has no one ever told me what this symbol represents? And what else haven't they told me? So we have to begin to do research. We have to begin to study to understand what we were never supposed to know and be able to apply that knowledge in our lives, to transform our lives so that we can begin to do the work that we were born to do. And so understand the history, understand what happened. This is the temple of Luxor, a pair of Tekken standing in front of this temple. In 1832, Muhammad Ali, the Turkish ruler of Egypt at that time, gave the Tekken that stood on the pedestal to the right to his friend, King Louis Philippe of France. Gave it to him as a gift. And that Tekken was taken out of Kemet to France. Where is it now? Well, the research that I'm doing on this new book, I spent several weeks last year in Europe. Because if you really want to study our history, you got to go to Europe. As Dr. Ben told us a long time ago, our history is in European museums. So I went to England, I went to France, I went to Germany, I went to Italy, to some of the finest Egyptian museums in the world to document our story. And it's all going to be in the next book. Went to Paris. At the Place de la Concorde stands the Tekken that was taken from ancient Kemet, from the temple of Ramesses II. Went to London. There's a Tekken on the banks of the Thames River in London. Even in Istanbul, there's a Tekken in Istanbul. Right here in the good old US of A, in New York City, there's a Tekken right behind the Metropolitan Museum. Kemetic symbols, which represent the resurrection of an African king. And how many people have told us what these symbols represent? What else haven't they told us? Went to Rome and found more Tekken in Rome than there are in Egypt. As Asa told us years ago, there was at one time over 1,200 Tekken in Kemet. But today in Egypt, there's only 7. There are more Tekken in Rome. There's a Tekken that stands right in front of the Vatican. All of the Tekken in Rome, there are 13 in Rome. And all of them stand in front of churches. All of them have crosses at the top, which symbolizes the Roman Catholic Church overpowering the pagan religions of the past. And they know what these symbols represent. That's why they have so many. So if we want to know ourselves, we've got to go where they are. We've got to go to their museums and do the research. We do all of this so that we can put the pieces of the puzzle together and not get angry at white folk because of what they did. It's our job to study and to apply that knowledge to transform our world. Anger does nothing for you, nothing healthy for you, nothing good for you. So you've got to apply some knowledge. You've got to study the past. Study the past so that you can understand very clearly how you got where you are today. Study the past so that you can understand how you went from building pyramids to living in the projects. Study the past so that you can understand how you went from being kings and queens to being players and getting played. Study the past, because all history is a current event. History repeats itself over and over and over again. So you study history. And as I as I bring this message to young folk, you know, they sometimes get overwhelmed by the names and the dates and the places. So sometimes it helps to break it down to them, to make it plain, as Malcolm said.